Quint's podcast.
Severe shortage of food, cooking gas and other essential items, skyrocketing fuel prices and a record high inflation. Sri Lanka is battling its worst economic crisis yet as it faces a critical shortfall of foreign currency leading to a massive reduction in imports of essential items. This economic nightmare has crippled the lives of common citizens who've been waiting in long queues across the country for grocery items and fuel. At least 2 elderly men reportedly died in different parts of the country just waiting in line for petrol and kerosene oil. And as anger against the government grows, troops have been deployed outside state-run petrol pumps to thwart protests that have been breaking out sporadically. But the economic meltdown has also affected millions of students, with the country cancelling school exams after running out of printing paper. And amid dwindling fuel supplies, there have been also long spells of power outage for several weeks now, with some blackouts lasting for as long as 7 hours. And unable to eke out a living at home, some citizens are even resorting to fleeing to India. So far, a total of 16 Sri Lankan refugees from Jaffna and Mannar arrived at Tamil Nadu in a boat on 22nd March in hopes of restarting their lives. And we'll bring you voices of some of these Sri Lankan refugees in this episode as they speak about the conditions back at home. But what are the various factors that led to such an unprecedented scale of economic crisis in the first place? How did the country fall into this vortex of debts? What is Sri Lanka doing to stave off this crisis? And as India extends $1 billion line of credit as assistance to the cash-strapped nation, will this move help India geopolitically? To talk about all this, I invited 2 guests to this episode. Saptarshi, a writer at the Quint's International News Desk, and N. Satyamurthy, head of Observer Research Foundation's Chennai initiative. Mr. Murthy has also been the editorial advisor at a trilingual TV group in Sri Lanka. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you. I'm your host, Shorbury. Over the past several months, we've been reading about how Sri Lanka's economic conditions are going on a downward spiral. As the country started to run out of its foreign exchange reserves, earlier in September 2021, President Rajapaksa had also declared an economic emergency. But to break down the significance of foreign reserves in simple words and how that has impacted the Sri Lankan economy, let's first start with what makes foreign exchange reserves so important. It is the fact that this is how countries pay for things that they buy from international markets, such as food or fuel. Now, the country has been spending quite a lot of foreign currency while not earning back enough. So now, with the foreign reserves nearly drying out, it means that there's not much left to finance imports anymore, including basics like food. And that's the reason behind this massive inflation. At 17.5%, the country's inflation rate hit a record high mark since 2015, and this is easily the worst economic crisis that the country has faced since 1948. In fact, the current situation has also been compared to the 1930s when Sri Lanka, then a British colony, was battered under the Great Depression that caused incredible hardships and suffering amongst its people. Sample this. Currently, just 400 grams of milk powder is costing around rupees 790, while a kilo pack is costing around rupees 1,945. Mary Claren, one of the Sri Lankan nationals who fled to India, talks about what kind of conditions forced them to take this decision to come to India. She also recounts that tough journey.
Picked us up at 10:30 p.m. and dropped us in the middle of the waters at 1 a.m. They said someone will come to pick us up, but no one came. We haven't eaten anything since last night. We couldn't even feed the baby. The prices are rising and we are unable to run a house. My husband even lost his job. So many refugees have come to India seeking a new life, and now that we have lost our livelihoods, many Sri Lankans are looking to find a home here.
Rajendran, her husband, says that there are no jobs back at home amid this severe inflation.
The situation is so poor that we can't even find jobs there. The prices of everything is rising and we can't afford anything anymore. Even if we work, we are given a meager amount.
Currently, Sri Lanka has about $2 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves left against a total debt repayment of as much as $7 billion in 2022, which includes a $1 billion repayment that is due in July. But you can say that it all began from 2007 when Sri Lanka started on its borrowing cycles that added up to its $11.8 billion worth of debt through sovereign bonds. But beyond reckless borrowings, the current economic quagmire stems from a host of other factors as well, such as questionable policies under successive governments, the collapse of the tourism sector owing to the COVID pandemic, and also to some extent the Russia-Ukraine war, which resulted in a fuel price hike. However, one of the recent disastrous policy moves experts are pointing out is Rajapaksa's decision to slash tax rates after coming to power in 2019. The plan was simple: cut taxes, increase spending, but then the pandemic came, crippling the tourism sector and reducing the government's revenues. Mr. Satyamurthy, head of ORF's Chennai initiative, says that while the Rajapaksa government can't escape responsibility, the fault lies with successive governments for increasing the debt burden of the country through development projects such as the infrastructure drives with China.
This is not an overnight phenomenon.
Right.
Successive governments have been following populist measures without relevance to their economy's inherent strengths and fundamentals. So this was bound to happen. So I won't say Rajapaksa government alone is to blame. That is my point. But they definitely cannot escape the responsibility in a few cases, like increasing the debt burden of the government by the development projects, particularly funded by China. China is not the only culprit there. But we always like to talk about China only. But and as the government claims, and I think the claims are correct,
Right.
China is not the biggest debtor to Sri Lanka. But China is also a debtor. But there is a difference between Chinese creditors. If India or Japan or someone other country invest in Sri Lanka for development project or something, they may supply some of the material, but they will also agree to buy products, material, construction material, whatever, from the local market. So this increases the capacity, financial capacity of the local economy, marketing economy, etc. Two, the labor always came from the local. In the last 10, 12 years, most of the development projects, big development infra projects, are funded by China. And China not only brought money and material, all the material, but also all the labor. Which means there was a negative effect on the labor market. The earning capacity of individuals and families took a huge hit, which the government did not, particularly the Rajapaksa government did not do anything about it. The successor government, which was that of their political rival, Ranil Wickremesinghe, they were in office from 2015 to 2019. They also did not attempt to correct it.
And speaking of the Chinese debt trap, China alone accounts for 10% or about $4.5 billion of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. And the Hambantota port, which is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, is one of the big examples of Sri Lanka's bad decisions. I got my colleague Saptarshi, who's a writer at the Quint's international news desk, to explain how Sri Lanka and China's economic ties have been and how the island country got buried in Chinese debts.
Well, Shortbreed, to put it simply, it's a very unequal relationship. The economic relationship between China and Sri Lanka is very one-sided in the sense that China gives a lot of loans to Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka accepts it, not just accepts it, it begs for it. China is Sri Lanka's fourth biggest lender behind international financial markets, the Asian Developmental Bank, and Japan. And over the last few years, over the last 10 years actually, China has lent Sri Lanka more than $5 billion for the construction of highways and ports mostly, but for also for other things such as airports and coal power plants, etc. Now, some critics and analysts say that these funds that are coming in from China, they are used for white elephant projects, which is basically a jargon for projects that have low returns and that have extremely high maintenance costs. So, for example, if China puts in money in a port, that port doesn't really give back enough money to Sri Lanka, and it also takes a lot of money to maintain control of that port. So, that is how the relationship has been so far.
But the question is, how did China fall into this Chinese debt in the first place?
So, one story is about a very famous port. The story is a story which a lot of people are already familiar with. It's Habantota port. And the story goes that the Sri Lankan government took loans at commercial rates from a bank called Exim Bank, Export Import Bank of China, to construct that port between 2007 and 2016. But the problem was, in between this period, after the port was fully constructed, it hardly attracted any ships. And if you don't attract ships, you can't levy tax, and there is rarely any other source of money. And this was something that was predicted by many analysts and people, and it still remains a puzzle why Sri Lanka went so forward with this, to the extent that it started suffering from path dependency. That, we have come so far, so let's just finish it. So by January 2015, because of external debt, especially with respect to this port, 10% of Sri Lanka's external debt was owed just to China. And one way to pay back this debt was to privatize a majority stake of the port to a Chinese company, which is, of course, owned by the Communist Party. And this is exactly what Sri Lanka did in 2017. It privatized a major stake to the China Merchants Port Holdings Company, and it completed a deal after which China controlled a 70% stake. So what it essentially did was it handed over control of that port to China and the 15,000 acres of land that surrounds it. And this is what experts are coming forward and calling debt trap diplomacy. That first China gives you money, then they give you money in projects which don't make profits, which don't give good returns. And then when Sri Lanka asks for help, China says, you know what, one way to help is just give us the whole project and we will own it. And that is what the 99-year lease is about.
Now, while all this weighed heavy on the economics of the country, Mr. Murthy explains that the tourism sector, something that the country relies on, also took a beating. First, the 2019 Easter blasts that left 250 people dead, including foreign citizens, led to a drop in tourist arrivals, and immediately after the pandemic hit, effectively drying up the tourism sector. Add to that disruptions to the exports.
And in between, you had the 2019 Easter bombings. That nearly 40 or 50 foreigners died. That was a big hit on tourism. Tourism is a major forex earner for the country. Then came, just as they were recovering, then came the COVID pandemic. COVID pandemic hit the country in more than one way. One, tourism was hit badly, as happened elsewhere too. Two, a lot of Sri Lankans, particularly Singalas, are working, male and women, are working in the Gulf and Europe as housewives, mechanics, drivers, in the service sector, low-end service sector. They were making a lot of remittances. That also stopped, and they came back home, fearing for their lives, or their employers shut down shop and all that, suspended operations. This was the two. Three, thanks again to COVID, exports stopped overnight. Tea and other things, governments. These three were immediate provocation. But it was building up over time.
But the question is, what now? What is the government planning to do to stave off this situation? One of the immediate priorities experts have pointed out is debt restructuring. And although President Rajapaksa requested Beijing to restructure its debt payments, it has been reported that the Chinese government turned its back on Sri Lanka. However, China is reportedly now considering a fresh request from Sri Lanka for a loan of $1 billion and a credit of $1.5 billion. After showing initial reluctance to take the IMF route, the government now has reportedly asked both the IMF and the World Bank for assistance. I also asked Mr. Murthy why the Sri Lankan government showed unwillingness to seek help from the IMF initially. One thing I want to understand from you, sir, is that why did the country seek help from India and China first before going to the IMF?
So the Rajapaksas have got they have a social and political ideology background. They were a little wary of going to IMF or even European nations or Western nations with the liberal capital or economy for investment. There is a suspicion and fear that the conditionalities imposed by IMF will be too much for the government and the political leadership to handle. That is also the past experience of the government reason they continue to say we will do it in the bilateral way.
Right.
And not go to IMF or others. But over time, they seem to have realized there is only so much friendly nations like India or China or US or whoever can invest in the country. Right. And that is only in the medium and long term.
Meanwhile, the country has also asked India for help, which has also extended $1 billion line of credit to the island nation. This will certainly help the cash-strapped nation a little bit, but does extending this also aid India geopolitically? Mr. Murthy weighs in.
See, definitely one thing is becoming clear. Much as the Indian strategic community feels that Rajapaksa especially have moved away from India and closer to China, the recent developments of India funding and financing various projects and this kind of line of credit for the government of Sri Lanka has brought them to the center, middle, or between China and India. That is a good development and good optics for an Indian community, strategic community. Otherwise, leave aside Rajapaksa's, the nation as a whole, the political consensus among the majority secular polity seems to be, I would say, not anti-China or rather pro-China. For instance, the Rajapaksas handed over the Hambantota port for development to the Chinese. Right. They had offered it to India. We did not take it for whatever reason. That's a different thing. But their successors handed over Hambantota territory to China, saying our Rajapaksas have indebted the country. This is the only way out. Right? So, there seems to be a national consensus, not just the Rajapaksas, when it comes to playing Peter against Paul, and China is a beneficiary at that stage. Right. Now, there's some sense seem to have returned, and they are also moving to the middle part.
And that's a wrap for this episode, but this is a developing story, so stay tuned. You can also check out a coverage and analytical pieces on this on the Quint's website. If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to the Big Story playlist for episodic updates. We're live on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website and check out the podcast section. For any feedback, shoot an email to podcasts@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.